Thanks for joining me for another story here on Dark Ascent. Today, I'm covering 4 Karens who put Everest on their bucket list and figured 6 weeks of preparation was enough. They had never climbed at altitude before, and when their guide tried to do his job, they threatened to sue him from a tent. Everest was about to punish every bad decision they'd made with devastating consequences. It was May 22nd, 2019. Mount Everest rises 29,032 feet above sea level, the highest point on Earth. Climbers on the standard South Col route had to cross the death zone above 26,000 feet, where that morning temperatures sat at negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit, with winds on the upper ridge driving the felt temperature down to negative 58. The idea for the expedition came from Barbara Morgan, a 51-year-old real estate broker from Scottsdale, Arizona. After watching a documentary about Everest, she decided the climb was overhyped. She had never been a mountaineer. One weekend hiking trip in Sedona and a few weekly spin classes were, in her mind, enough preparation. When one outfitter refused to take her because she lacked experience, did she rethink the plan? No, she found another company that would. It's funny how documentaries can inspire completely different people. Some finish one and think, what an incredible achievement. Barbara finished one and thought, I could probably do that. For Peggy Hughes, a 48-year-old lifestyle blogger from Nashville, the expedition was as much about content as it was about climbing. She packed professional camera gear, a ring light, and had already written her summit caption before arriving in Nepal. If she reached the top, she wanted the photos to look effortless. I don't know why, but the ring light made me laugh for a second. Then I remembered where they were taking it. Nancy Henderson, a 53-year-old pharmaceutical sales manager from Charlotte, had a habit of believing she was the most informed person in the room. She spent weeks researching altitude sickness online, assembled her own medical kit, and arrived convinced she understood the risks, as well as the guides did. Advice she agreed with was useful. Advice she didn't was usually dismissed. Then there was Janet Matthews, a 46-year-old corporate attorney from Chicago. She approached the climb the same way she approached everything else. She had paid for a summit, and she expected to get one. If someone or something stood in the way, she wasn't shy about complaining, arguing, or threatening legal action. The 4 women had met through an online group for women, over 40 interested in adventure travel. Barbara suggested Everest, and the others signed on. Just 6 weeks later, they had found an operator willing to take them. None of them had previous high-altitude climbing experience. Reputable companies would have required them to prove themselves on mountains like Kilimanjaro or Aconcagua first. This company didn't. That was exactly why they chose it. 6 weeks. I spent longer than that trying to pick a new couch that my cat would probably ignore anyway. The group arrived in Kathmandu in mid-April before making their way to Lukla and beginning the trek to Everest Base Camp. The hike takes over a week for a reason. It isn't just about reaching the mountain. It's the first stage of acclimatization, giving the body time to adjust to thinner air. By the time they reached Namche Bazaar, the altitude was already taking its toll. Barbara ignored her headache and kept walking. Peggy turned hers into a video, calling it part of the experience. Nancy diagnosed herself with mild altitude sickness, took medication without telling the guide, and trusted her own judgment. Janet insisted she felt fine and spent the rest day on work calls instead. They reached base camp on April 24th. For many climbers, standing beneath Everest is the moment reality sets in. The size of the mountain has a way of making people question whether they're truly ready. Did it change this group? Not really. Barbara immediately started rearranging the tents. Peggy filmed a base camp tour. Nancy reviewed her medication schedule. Janet complained about the sleeping bags. I can't imagine meeting these 4 for the first time at base camp. It feels like every conversation would have ended with someone asking to speak to the manager. That evening, their lead guide, an experienced Everest veteran, explained the acclimatization plan, turnaround times, and oxygen procedures. When he finished, Barbara asked if they could shorten the schedule to fit everyone's travel plans. The answer was simple: no. She even asked the agency for a different guide. They refused. A few days later came the first climb through the Khumbu Icefall, one of the most dangerous sections of the route. All 4 women struggled. That wasn't unusual, but their guide noted they were moving much slower than expected. Peggy even stopped to film despite being told not to. The icefall wasn't the place to pause for content. The group reached Camp 1, rested, and returned to base camp without incident. But their guide had seen enough. That evening, he told the agency he didn't believe the group's fitness was adequate for a summit attempt and recommended another acclimatization rotation. Barbara dismissed the concern, calling the guide overly difficult. I felt a little bad for the guide here. He was trying to do his job while 4 people kept treating him like an obstacle instead of an expert. On May 3rd, they climbed to Camp 2 at 21,000 feet, where the air contains roughly half the oxygen available at sea level. Nancy's headache had never really gone away. She also began waking up gasping for air, a common effect of high altitude, but still a sign that her body was struggling. She recognized what it was, wrote it in her journal, and never mentioned it to the guide. Peggy's oxygen saturation measured just 81%, lower than the guide expected for someone at that stage of acclimatization. He was concerned. Peggy insisted the device was wrong. Meanwhile, Janet spent the rest day sending another complaint to the agency about the guide instead of listening to his concerns. The group returned to base camp on May 5th to recover before the summit push. That's how acclimatization works. The body adapts during the rest, not while climbing. Barbara wasn't happy with the schedule. Why spend extra days on another rotation when they already had return flights to catch? She suggested skipping Camp 3 altogether. The guide immediately shut the idea down. Without that stop, the risk of serious altitude illness increased dramatically. Barbara accepted the answer, then called the agency hoping for a different one. She got the same response. The Camp 3 rotation went ahead on May 9th. At 24,000 feet, the guide performed a simple coordination test used to spot early signs of altitude affecting the brain. Barbara stumbled. She laughed it off, blaming the uneven ground. Nancy completed the test, but showed subtle signs of slowed coordination. The guide recommended both women descend for more recovery. Both refused. He documented it. That night, Barbara vomited twice and became so dizzy she couldn't sit upright for hours. By morning, she told no one and acted as though nothing had happened. The group remained at base camp while strong winds continued over the upper mountain. Forecasts suggested a narrow weather window might open within a few days, but until then the guide refused to move higher. All 4 women pushed back. Janet even contacted the agency, accusing the guide of intentionally delaying the climb and threatening legal action. The guide didn't budge. When the weather window finally arrived, the team climbed through Camps 2 and 3 before reaching Camp 4 at the South Col on the afternoon of May 21st. They rested only long enough to prepare their equipment before leaving for the summit at 10 that night. That's a tough position to be in. You're responsible for everyone's safety, but at the end of the day, they're still adults, and these 4 definitely weren't making his job any easier. The final briefing took place on the evening of May 21st. The guide reviewed the oxygen plan, emergency procedures, and one rule above all others. If you hadn't reached the summit by 1 in the afternoon, you turned around. No exceptions. Each woman said she understood. The guide wasn't convinced they meant it. To understand what happened next, you first have to understand what the death zone does to the human body. Above 26,000 feet, there's simply not enough oxygen for the body to function normally. It can't truly adapt. It can only survive there for a limited time. Muscles weaken, reaction times slow, and most dangerously, judgment begins to fail. That's what makes high altitude so deceptive. One of the first things oxygen deprivation affects is your ability to recognize that something is wrong. Bad decisions can feel perfectly reasonable. Add freezing temperatures, dehydration, exhaustion, and days of pushing through warning signs, and the margin for error all but disappears. By the time a climber realizes they're in serious trouble, they're often already running out of time. The summit push began at 10 that night. The South Col was dark, bitterly cold, and crowded with climbers taking advantage of the same narrow weather window. Headlamps stretched up the mountain in a slow-moving line as dozens of teams made their way toward the summit. Each woman climbed with her own Sherpa, while the lead guide moved between them, checking on each climber as the line stretched across the mountain. For the first few hours, the climb went as expected. It was slow, exhausting, but steady. Then Peggy started removing her oxygen mask. The first time, she wanted to film the line of headlamps climbing above her. Her Sherpa quickly noticed and put the mask back on. About 40 minutes later, she did it again. The third time, she left it off for nearly 4 minutes before anyone realized what she'd done. Why was that so dangerous? Above 26,000 feet, supplemental oxygen isn't a comfort. It's what helps keep the brain functioning. Remove it for even a few minutes and blood oxygen levels can drop enough to affect judgment. The problem is that the climber usually doesn't notice it happening. The effects had already started. Peggy just couldn't feel them yet. By 4 that morning, 6 hours after leaving the South Col, The group reached the balcony at 27,500 feet. Climbers usually stop there to change oxygen cylinders and catch their breath before tackling the steeper terrain above. They were already behind the pace the guide had hoped for, leaving little room for delays if they were going to respect the 1 o'clock turnaround time. This is where Everest stories often change. Until now, everything has been about reaching the summit. From here on, it's about getting off the mountain. As the group rested and swapped oxygen bottles, the guide looked over each climber one by one. It was then that his attention settled on Nancy. Nancy's Sherpa had been watching her closely for the past 40 minutes. He quietly told the guide that something wasn't right. Her steps had become uneven. She kept stopping for no clear reason, and at one point, she had simply sat down on the fixed rope until he helped her back up. When the guide reached her, Nancy was standing with her eyes open, but her reaction seemed delayed. She told him she felt fine. He then asked her to walk 3 heel-to-toe steps across the flat ground at the balcony. She managed 2 before drifting sideways on the 3rd. What was happening had likely been building for days. High-altitude cerebral edema, or HACE, develops when the brain is deprived of oxygen and begins to swell. Because the skull can't expand, pressure builds inside the head. One of the first things that pressure affects is balance and coordination. That's why climbers are given simple neurological tests like walking heel to toe. A person with early HACE can still believe they're thinking clearly. Their body often reveals the problem first. I still can't quite wrap my head around that. Your own brain can become the least reliable witness to what's happening. Nancy had been showing early signs of this since Camp 3. The mild ataxia on the walk test, the persistent headache she had been medicating around rather than treating, the periodic breathing at night. Each of those was a signal. She had interpreted all of them as manageable. She had been wrong. The guide told her she needed to descend immediately. He was direct. He told her that what he was seeing in her coordination was a sign of serious altitude illness, and that continuing upward would make it worse, not better. Nancy told him she had not spent $42,000 to turn around at the balcony. She turned and began moving up the rope. The guide could not physically force a client to descend. He radioed base camp, documented the refusal by time and location, and told Nancy's Sherpa to stay within arm's reach of her for the remainder of the climb. Then he made the decision to continue, because stopping the entire group at the balcony was not a realistic option, and because he still had 3 other clients on the rope above the death zone who needed managing. The push from the balcony to the south summit covers roughly 1,200 vertical feet of increasingly technical terrain. The southeast ridge narrows, the exposure increases. The fixed ropes run along sections of mixed snow and rock where a misstep is not just a stumble, it is a fall. Nancy fell twice between the balcony and the south summit. I think a lot of us imagine serious altitude sickness looking dramatic. Sometimes it starts with something as simple as one missed step. The first fall happened at approximately 28,000 feet on a short rocky step in the fixed rope. She lost her footing on a patch of ice and went down on her right knee. Her Sherpa caught her harness before she went further. She got back up without assistance and kept moving. She did not acknowledge the fall. The second fall came about 200 vertical feet higher. Nancy wasn't climbing over anything difficult when her left leg simply stopped responding. She dropped sideways onto the fixed rope and hung there until her Sherpa helped her back to her feet. She never said a word. She just kept climbing. By then, her condition had advanced well beyond the early stages. The swelling in her brain was affecting both her coordination and her judgment. That was the cruel reality of HACE. The part of the brain needed to recognize something was wrong was the same part that was beginning to fail. Nancy truly believed she could keep going. I think that's what makes HACE so frightening. It doesn't just make you sick, it convinces you you're not. The group reached the south summit at 7:15 that morning, more than 9 hours after leaving Camp 4. Ahead of them lay the Cornice Traverse, the Hillary Step, and the final 300 vertical feet to the summit. The guide called a 10-minute rest and assessed the group. Barbara was exhausted, but she remained coordinated and alert. Every step looked deliberate after hours in the death zone. When the group stopped, she sat down in the snow without even looking toward the summit. After a few minutes, Barbara and her Sherpa continued toward the Hillary Step while the guide stayed behind to assess Nancy and Peggy more closely. Peggy was slowing down too. When the guide spoke to her, there was a noticeable pause before she answered. Her face had gone strangely expressionless, and for the past hour, her Sherpa had been taking more and more of her weight on the rope. Hours of climbing, poor nutrition, and repeatedly removing her oxygen mask were beginning to catch up with her. She wasn't in immediate danger, but she was getting close. Nancy worried the guide the most. She had been sitting in the snow for more than 20 minutes without saying a word. Her eyes were open and she was breathing normally, but when the guide knelt down and called her name, she stared at him for a moment as if she didn't recognize him. When she finally answered, the single word she spoke had nothing to do with the question he had asked. Then there was Janet. She had watched a climber's video at base camp that seemed to show a shortcut around part of the standard route. Twice during the expedition, she had asked the guide about it. Twice he told her the same thing. There was no alternate route. Anything off the fixed rope at that altitude wasn't a shortcut. It was a fall. Janet heard him. She just didn't believe him. It almost makes me want to know which video she watched. Whatever she saw, it gave her enough confidence to trust it over someone who'd actually been there. While the guide focused on Nancy and checked her oxygen equipment, congestion briefly separated Janet from her Sherpa. Before he could close the gap, Janet unclipped herself from the fixed rope and stepped onto the exposed ridge to the left. The Cornice Traverse is one of the most exposed sections of Everest. At nearly 28,700 feet, the route follows a narrow ridge. The fixed rope is the only real protection. Step off it, and there's very little chance to recover. It's one of those places where a few feet doesn't sound like much until you realize which side of those few feet you're standing on. Janet moved about 15 feet away from the rope. Her left crampon punched through a thin layer of wind-packed snow, hiding empty space beneath it. She lost her footing, slid across the hard ice, and disappeared over the edge of the southwest face. Two climbers higher on the route saw it happen. They later described the same sequence: the scrape of metal on ice, a climber sliding sideways, and then nothing. The guide turned at the sound and immediately realized Janet was gone. He radioed base camp at 7:29 that morning. Barbara and her Sherpa had already continued beyond the south summit and were nearing the Hillary Step. He radioed them to spend as little time on the summit as possible before beginning their descent immediately. His attention turned to the climbers, still with him. Nancy was barely responsive. Peggy was deteriorating rapidly. He ordered Peggy's Sherpa to begin an immediate assisted descent, while he stayed with Nancy and her Sherpa. Barbara and her Sherpa reached the summit at 9:04 that morning. They turned around almost immediately and began descending. On the descent, Peggy's condition worsened quickly. Once the body begins to fail at that altitude, it doesn't recover on its own. The only real treatment is getting lower and restoring oxygen, and Peggy had been running short on both for hours. Her Sherpa did everything he could. He took more of her weight on the rope, guided her over the steeper sections, and kept urging her onward. By the time they reached the fixed anchor below the south summit at around 9:50 that morning, Peggy was stopping every few steps, not because she wanted a break, but because her legs were no longer responding the way they should. This hadn't happened all at once. It had been building since she first removed her oxygen mask the night before. Hours of inadequate oxygen had slowly taken their toll. When she finally sat down against the anchor just after 10 o'clock, her Sherpa checked her oxygen saturation. It had dropped to just 49%. To put that in context, a saturation of 49% is the level at which the brain begins to lose the ability to maintain consciousness. It is not a warning sign at that point, it is the edge. Peggy told the Sherpa she needed 1 minute. She lost consciousness at 10:14 in the morning. The Sherpa couldn't move her alone. The terrain was too steep, and they were standing on an exposed section of the ridge. Trying to lower an unconscious climber by himself would have put both of them at risk. So he kept her oxygen mask in place, secured her to the anchor as best he could, radioed the guide, and remained with her until he was forced to descend. By the time the guide received the radio call about Peggy, Nancy had been unresponsive for more than 30 minutes. He and her Sherpa were already trying to lower her down the mountain using a two-person assisted carry. She was completely limp. The only sign she was still alive was her slow, irregular breathing, with long pauses between breaths. This breathing pattern is known as Cheney-Stokes respiration. It occurs when swelling from high-altitude cerebral edema begins affecting the brainstem, which controls breathing. By this stage, the pressure inside the skull is severe, and the brain is beginning to shut down. As it worsens, breathing, consciousness, and eventually the heart begin to fail. At 10:41 in the morning, Nancy's breathing changed. The pauses between breaths grew longer. The guide counted the seconds between them. At 10:53 in the morning, the breathing stopped. Barbara and her Sherpa reached the south summit on the descent at 10:38. The guide told her Sherpa to take her down immediately without stopping. She reached Camp 4 at 1:17 in the afternoon. The first distress call went out at 7:29 in the morning, immediately after Janet's fall. The second came at 10:14 when Peggy lost consciousness. The third at 10:53 when Nancy's breathing stopped. By early afternoon, wind at the South Col had increased to 51 miles per hour. No helicopter could operate above base camp in those conditions. A ground rescue team that had been staged at a lower camp began moving toward Camp 4 but could not push above the South Col that day. The guide and the Sherpas brought Barbara down to Camp 4 and stayed with her through the night. The following morning, May 23rd, conditions improved enough for a 2-person recovery team to push above the South Col. They reached the South Summit Ridge by mid-morning. Peggy was found at the anchor point where her Sherpa had been forced to leave her mask still in place. Nancy was found approximately 30 feet below the South Summit, at the point where the guide and her Sherpa had been forced to stop when she died. A search of the southwest face from base camp using spotting equipment found no visible sign of Janet. The terrain on that face is not accessible for recovery operations. 2 independent climbing teams provided written witness statements confirming what they had seen at 7:29. The guide's radio log, time-stamped at the moment of the call, was consistent with both accounts. Barbara was evacuated by helicopter from base camp on May 24th and transported to a medical facility in Kathmandu. When rescue teams returned to the South Summit Ridge the following morning, they found Peggy Hughes with her camera still inside her pack. The footage captured nearly the entire summit push, showing her repeatedly removing her oxygen mask, her pace slowing, and the gradual changes in her behavior as oxygen deprivation took hold. Investigators concluded she lost consciousness from severe hypoxia before dying from exposure. About 30 feet below the South Summit, Nancy Henderson's body was recovered where the rescue attempt had ended. Medication found in her pack, together with the guide's notes and witness accounts, showed that high-altitude cerebral edema, or HAS, had been developing for well over a day. Despite repeated warning signs, she continued climbing. Her death was ruled the result of advanced haze, and investigators found no negligence by the guide or Sherpa team. Janet Matthews was never recovered. Her GPS device was found near the point where she had unclipped from the fixed rope on the Cornice Traverse. Witness statements, GPS data, and the guide's radio logs all reached the same conclusion. She had left the established route and fallen thousands of feet down the southwest face. Her death was ruled accidental. Barbara Morgan was the only member of the group to make it off the mountain alive. She was flown to Kathmandu, where doctors treated her for severe frostbite and early high-altitude pulmonary edema. Although the fluid in her lungs cleared with oxygen and medical care, 2 fingers on her right hand had to be amputated. She was discharged from the hospital 9 days later. Maybe that's the hardest lesson from this story. There are some parts of the journey you simply can't skip, no matter how much you're willing to spend.